and welcome to China's Living Language.
欢迎来到我的频道。
How do you delegate absolute authority? I mean, the kind of power you need to run an entire warring state without, at the same time handing the keys to a rival who could just overthrow you.
It's the central paradox, isn't it? It has haunted every sovereign, every CEO, really every commander since the dawn of organization.
Exactly. The king needs a second in command, a number two, to actually execute his will across a huge territory. But that same powerful deputy, the one who sits closest to the throne, almost always becomes the single greatest, most existential threat to the crown.
It really is like an iron law of political physics. You hire a political genius, a master administrator, a ruthless commander to run the country for you.
And suddenly you have two people running the country.
Exactly. And the difference between the sovereign and the chief executive is often just, one successful conspiracy or one strategic mistake. This tension is just. It's inherent in centralization.
If the organization is too big for one person to manage alone,
then the person you appoint to help inevitably starts to control everything.
And in 309 BC, the mighty, ambitious state of Qin, which was, rapidly swallowing up its neighbors during the brutal warring states period, they decided they were going to try and rewrite those rules.
They faced this universal problem head on.
They did. They decided to engineer a structural solution to this number two problem by splitting the most powerful executive job in the land. So the question we're diving into is, was this an act of true institutional genius, creating a system of checks and balances?
Or was it an instant guarantee of crippling internal disaster? That is the core mission for this deep dive. We're focusing on a moment that looks deceptively simple in the ancient texts. It's a single, a very cryptic historical entry from 309 BC.
This was the 6th year of King Nan of Zhou, though, ironically, Zhou was the fading power.
Right.
Qin was the rising star.
Right. And the entry tells us that Qin established the office of Prime Minister Cheng-she-ahng for the first time, appointing Zhu as the Prime Minister of the right.
That one line is just packed with political dynamite. I mean, first they invented a brand new title, the Cheng-she-ahng.
Brand new.
And the absolute moment they established it, they immediately divided it, a left and a right. This was no minor administrative tweak like, splitting the Department of Agriculture.
No. This abrupt, immediate split signals a genuine, violent political earthquake that had been building inside Qin's power structure for a long, long time.
And what's so fascinating to me is how incomplete that initial record is.
It gives us an instant puzzle, doesn't it? One that took centuries of scholarship to even begin to solve. The very act of creating this dual office was so radical that the historical record itself it struggled to contain it.
So let's start with that glaring omission. I mean, it's right there in the text. We're clearly told that Zhu was named the Prime Minister of the right. But the record just stops cold. There's no mention of a Prime Minister of the left. It's a huge historical gap.
And it feels less like a simple mistake, doesn't it? It feels more like a deliberate political omission. Like the record is trying to manage a very sensitive transition. Right. Precisely. History is often less about recording facts dispassionately and much, much more about managing the gaps, managing the omissions and, the uncomfortable truths of past political maneuvering.
So when later historians looked at this, they knew something was missing.
They had to. They realized this entry was either politically sanitized or just incomplete because the conflict that immediately followed was so complex. The chroniclers couldn't neatly assign credit or blame.
It sounds like some of them just gave up trying to figure it out.
They did. They really did. We know that some scholars, like Zhu, when he was editing the Chronicle, he basically just cut out the left and right distinction altogether.
Really?
Yeah. He just wrote that Qin first established the prime minister. That's the easy way out, right? Just erase the evidence of the split, pretend the position was singular from the start.
But that ignores the entire point. The structural brilliance or maybe the madness of the king's decision.
Exactly. But thankfully, other scholars took the necessary approach, a forensic reconstruction. They understood that if the king created a prime minister of the right, there had to be a prime minister of the left. The structure itself demands a partner.
It's the logic of the design.
It's the logic of institutional design, yes. The structure exists to facilitate a dual function, so the people must have existed. Lu Zuchan, a really meticulous scholar, he was working on his Dashuji, and he deduced it. He filled in that missing piece of the puzzle.
And who was it?
Gan Mao. He concluded that Gan Mao was appointed the prime minister of the left. And look, this wasn't just academic guesswork. It was a political necessity for making any sense of the transition of power and, all the diplomatic history that followed in Qin.
So, okay, now we have the full picture. The king institutes a split executive office, and he fills it with two incredibly powerful figures, Xu Lizi.
The man of the royal bloodline, the military hero.
Yeah. And Gan Mao, the talented but foreign bureaucrat. So, why these two? And why at this exact moment? What was the catalyst for all of this?
The catalyst was the immense shadow cast by the man who held the singular chief executive role right before them, Zhang Yi. This dual appointment wasn't really about improving bureaucratic efficiency, even though that might have been the public excuse.
It was politically.
It was a strategic political alliance designed to collectively seize and immediately fragment the vast singular authority that Zhang Yi had monopolized.
Okay, so let's contextualize Zhang Yi for a moment. He wasn't just some powerful minister. This guy was a political giant. He dominated the entire diplomatic landscape of the Warring States period.
He really did. His influence was so great that he often acted as the king's equal. He was a true master strategist, one of the most successful ministers Qin ever had, especially in foreign policy.
And he built up this empire of power.
He had aggregated so much of it, military, administrative, diplomatic, that he was, for all intents and purposes, running the entire state. And when a figure of that caliber leaves the stage, the institutional vacuum they leave behind it's terrifying to the sovereign.
Because anyone who steps into that role gets all that power.
Exactly. The king realized that allowing any one successor to inherit all of Zhang Yi's authority would be political suicide.
So it's the ultimate divide and conquer strategy, but applied internally.
That's a perfect way to put it.
The king lets two powerful, ambitious men share the number 2 seat, knowing they'll probably spend their energy checking each other.
Rather than coordinating against the throne, it's a calculated decision. The king is valuing internal political conflict over, say, administrative efficiency.
He's choosing stability for himself over a smooth-running government.
He is. The dual role was created specifically to fragment the power that Zhang Yi had built up. By putting two powerful and, potentially rivalrous figures in the chair at the same time, the king ensured that no single person, no matter how talented, could ever inherit the full, dangerous scope of Zhang Yi's former power.
It was power distribution by enforced rivalry.
Yes.
Okay, let's turn to the title itself, because you said it was new, and this feels crucial for understanding the political signal the king was sending. The history says this new role was the Cheng-she-ahng, and it was established for the first time. So this implies a huge institutional shift. But if this title was new, what was Zhang Yi called? I mean, was he not a prime minister?
This specific point caused deep confusion, even among the major ancient scholars. The heavyweight Southern Sum dynasty scholar, Huang Zhen, he argued precisely that. The unique title Cheng-she-ahng begins here in 309 BC.
So it marks this moment as fundamentally different from everything that came before.
Yes, that was his argument. The idea is that the title was new, marking the moment as different. But, and this is the key,
but the job of chief executive already existed.
That is the crucial distinction. The title was new, confirming the structure was new, but the role of the single chief executive was definitely not. And we know this thanks to, irrefutable archaeological confirmation. This is where the dust of history yields actual concrete evidence.
Okay, this is where we have to connect the dots with the archaeology.
Right.
In 1983, there was a major breakthrough, right? The excavation of the non-Yue king's tomb. What did they find there?
They found a bronze halberd. It was a ceremonial weapon, high rank, and it was inscribed with a clear date, year 4 of the king, which we can date to 321 BC, just a few years before this dual appointment.
And the inscription.
Crucially, the inscription identified the chief supervisor of some royal project as Xiangbang Yang Yi. This proved definitively that Yang Yi was the supreme executive of the nation.
Xiangbang. And that title, it translates roughly to the chancellor of the state.
Right. It was the singular, all-encompassing chief executive role. It meant Yang Yi was the supreme administrative and often the supreme military commander.
So Yang Yi was undeniably the number 2. But his role, the Xiangbang, was singular and monopolistic.
Exactly. Whereas the new Cheng-she-ahng, left and right, was fundamentally a shared, diluted position. The creation of the dual title isn't the birth of the executive role. It's the institutionalization of its division.
It's a deliberate rebranding that screams dilution of power. That makes perfect sense. The king is saying, we are no longer allowing a single monopolistic chancellor, a Xiong Bang. From now on, we're installing 2 prime ministers who are subservient to me.
And we should add a quick but important historical footnote here, just for the listener, about this title. You often see Zhang Yi's old singular role referred to as Shi-ang-gu in later texts. The character Bang was swapped for Guo.
Why the linguistic change? I mean, that's a highly technical detail, but it feels like it speaks volumes about how history is managed over time.
It's pure political expediency centuries later. The character Bang was part of the personal name of the first Han Emperor, Liu Bang. So out of deep respect, Han Dynasty historians avoided using their founder's personal name. They were compelled to substitute the character Bang with Guo, which means state or nation. So the title became Chancellor of the State. This simple change just shows how later political taboos can unintentionally distort the original historical record.
So to recap, we've established that the singular powerful number 2 existed, that it became too dangerous under Zhang Yi, and the king engineered this split as a direct reaction.
Right.
So now let's move beyond just this specific moment and look at the deep institutional forces within Qin that made the number 2 position so uniquely dangerous in the first place.
Yes, we're moving from the specific anecdote to the underlying axiom of Qin's power structure.
We're talking about what's been called the Iron Law of Oligarchy, but specifically in ancient Qin. Every large organization, every political structure, it demands an inner circle, right? The sheer necessity of scale means the leader cannot govern alone. He needs that closest confidant. And whoever stands closest to the throne, that person becomes the number 2.
That necessity is universal. But Qin's specific historical environment, it supercharged it. We can look at the sociologist Robert Michael's Iron Law of Oligarchy. He argued that all organizations, even those that start with, democratic ideals, inevitably trend toward rule by a small, centralized elite.
Why is that?
Because scale requires efficiency and specialization.
So the oligarchy isn't really a political choice. It's more like an organizational default setting once you reach a certain size.
Exactly. And in the brutally competitive environment of the Warring States period, the pressure of constant existential survival accelerated the centralization dramatically. They couldn't rely on temporary feudal arrangements or, ad hoc councils.
They needed permanent institutions.
Highly efficient permanent institutions, just to successfully raise, feed, and deploy armies large enough to survive the next campaign.
And what did that pressure create in Qin? What was the outcome?
Well, it burst the stable, centralized government structure that we'd recognize today, driven primarily by the need for massive standing armies. Under the old feudal system, kings would mobilize regional lords and their troops when they were needed.
But total war requires something different.
Total war requires massive, permanently organized forces available at a moment's notice, marching across vast territories.
And managing a standing army requires stable bureaucracy, complex logistics, treasury management, continuous supply lines, all of which require formalized, dedicated roles of administration and supreme command.
And this need is what formalized the role of the number 2. But this is where Qin developed a unique, almost self-destructive institutional inertia compared to its neighbors in the Central Plain, like Wei or Han.
Okay, so what was the contrast? How was Qin different from the others?
In those other states, political specialization led to a separation of powers that served as a natural check. Civil roles and military roles were strictly separated.
Held by different people.
Often held by different individuals, yes. The Xiong, or the Chancellor, handled internal administration and domestic policy, while the Zheang, the general, led the army in the field. This division provided a natural check and balance.
Because the administrative chief could never unilaterally command the full military force.
Precisely. But in Qin, things were, catastrophically different. They operated under what we can call the general plus chancellor model.
And that's the core flaw.
That is the core institutional flaw that Zhang Yi had exploited so brilliantly. Thanks to the sweeping reforms instituted much earlier by Xiangyang, Qin's power structure fundamentally fused these 2 roles.
So the number 2, whatever he was called.
Whether he was called Xiang, Daliang Zhao, or any other high rank, was not only managing internal affairs, administering justice, and controlling the treasury, he was expected and often required to lead the troops in the field.
So you have the ultimate political power all aggregated into a single position. The ultimate general CEO who oversaw both the budgets and the battalions.
And this fusion was rooted deep in Qin's unique almost Spartan-like militarized society. Social mobility, prestige, land, wealth. It was all tied directly to military merit.
Often measured by the number of enemy heads presented after a battle, right?
Literally. So if you wanted to reach the pinnacle of power, you absolutely had to have battlefield credentials. A civilian administrator, no matter how clever, just could not command the ultimate respect of the state.
So even the highest official, Zhang Yi, this singular number 2, he couldn't just be a spreadsheet wizard running the government from the capital.
No, he had to be a fief commander, a man of martial renown.
And the problem with that general plus chancellor model, I mean, while it might be incredibly efficient for fighting a war.
It is, because there's no division between political will and military execution.
Right, but politically, it's just incredibly volatile. It concentrates vast, unchecked power into one man's hands.
It creates a scenario where the number 2 controls the treasury, the bureaucracy, and the instruments of force. At that point, the number 2 can potentially neutralize or even capture the king, turning the sovereign into a mere figurehead.
And the King of Qin knew this. He saw this deep structural flaw.
He had to. He knew he needed to dilute this power immediately after Zhang Yi was gone. And the most logical, common sense solution, if he just looked at his neighbors, would be to finally adopt their practice.
Separate the civil and military power.
Exactly.
That's what modern organizational theory would tell you to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Break the job into 2 non-overlapping roles. So why didn't the King of Qin do it? Why was Qin so utterly trapped by its own culture?
Because for Qin, that separation was institutionally impossible. It violated the core warrior tradition that defined the entire state. If the king had appointed a purely civilian Xiang to manage the administration and a purely military Xiang to lead the armies, the structure would have instantly destabilized.
Why? Because of the prestige hierarchy.
Exactly. In Qin's warrior code, how could a purely civilian official, an administrator whose highest rank came from, well, from pushing paper, ever rank as high as a seasoned military leader, the ultimate warrior?
Not in a state built entirely on military success.
The societal contract, the very source of Qin's strength, would not allow it. The civilian Xian would always be seen as subordinate to the military Jiang, or vice versa, and it would lead to immediate political paralysis and failure.
So the king was trapped by his own state's unique, successful, but very rigid, militarized culture. He couldn't break the job horizontally into civil and military parts because of the warrior code's inherent power imbalance.
And that forces the calculated, almost desperate solution we see in 309 BC. Since the job couldn't be broken by function, they broke the singularity of the role itself.
They split the number 2 position into 2 peers, the left and right prime ministers, the Cheng-she-ahng.
This wasn't the optimal institutional design for governance. It was the only institutional design that was possible, forced by Qin's unique, rigid, and intensely militarized warrior politics.
They traded one singular, fatal threat for 2 competing checks.
It's an attempt to mitigate risk by ensuring the 2 most powerful executives spend more time actively competing with each other, struggling for the king's favor and authority.
Then coordinating against him.
Precisely. The number 2 position is an inevitability, so the king's task became engineering a structure that guaranteed that inevitability would be inherently unstable.
It sounds like the king chose institutional friction over operational efficiency. A genius tactical move, maybe, but a terrible long-term management structure.
I think that's right.
Let's go back to the linguistic structure of the title they invented, Cheng-she-ahng, because you said it's a political signal written in language. The original powerful executive role was simply Xiangbang, the chancellor. And the fundamental meaning of Xiang is to help, right?
That's correct. Historically, it means the one who helps the sovereign. We see this in ancient texts describing how the Duke of Zhou Xiang, King Cheng, he helped him, often acting as a regent or a chief aide. It implied assistance and secondary authority.
Okay, so now they add the character Cheng to create the Cheng-she-ahng. But you're saying Cheng itself also means to help?
It does. It's linguistically redundant.
And this redundancy is the king's political masterstroke.
I think so. If we analyze it literally as the new title, helper, helper, or maybe the one who assists the one who helps the sovereign. Regardless of how you parse the grammar, the name signifies a deliberate and substantial dilution of authority.
The king is signaling, both to the men who hold the office and to the whole aristocracy watching.
Yes, he's signaling that this job is now defined by subservience.
It's almost as if the king wanted to create a title so watered down that he chose a word meaning help and just doubled it. It sounds less like a commander of the state and more like a bureaucracy of assistants.
It's a linguistic maneuver to try and counteract political gravity. The king is signaling that the job is less about commanding the nation and more about assisting the throne. But, political semantics rarely overcome the practical realities of command and talent.
And the first attempt at actually implementing this dual leadership was structurally doomed. Not just because of the job split, but because the two guys they chose were just fundamentally mismatched.
You couldn't have picked a more volatile pairing. On one side, you have Gan Mao, the prime minister of the left,
The foreigner.
the known foreigner. He lacked deep ancestral roots and legitimacy within the Qin aristocracy. His power rested entirely on his administrative brilliance and, the king's current favor. He was a purely meritocratic appointment.
And then contrasted against him, you have Chu-li, the prime minister of the right, a royal prince, an established popular war hero.
A figure with inherent legitimacy and traditional military prestige. He didn't just have the king's favor, he had blood and tradition on his side.
So on the org chart, they're peers, 50-50.
On paper, yes. But in the brutal reality of the Qin political system, how could they ever be equals? Conflict was structurally inevitable because the system placed two executives of fundamentally different weight and pedigree into a single shared office.
So we can assume their policy goals diverged pretty much immediately, leading to what? Institutional paralysis.
Absolutely. Think about it. Gan Mao, the foreigner, he needed constant military success and bureaucratic expansion to prove his worth. So he's driving an aggressive foreign policy.
While Chu-li, the royal insider,
he likely prioritized internal security and consolidating the aristocracy's power. He probably viewed Gan Mao's aggressive expansion as risky and destabilizing. This kind of inherent political and personal friction ensures that the number 2 seat remains effectively neutralized.
which is exactly what the king intended.
Exactly.
But the whole point of creating a number 2 in the first place is efficiency and singular direction. If the king's solution to the number 2 problem was guaranteed conflict, that only bought him time, right? It didn't solve the long-term institutional flaw.
And that leads us to the ultimate proof that the king failed to rewrite political physics. Did this ingenious dual prime minister system actually stick around?
No.
No. It's a recurring, undeniable pattern in Qin history. They repeatedly reverted to the singular chief executive, which proves that institutional design eventually yields to the reality of power and, crucially, to individual talent.
The gravitational pull of competence is stronger than the organizational chart.
It is. When peerless figures emerged, people who were simply too effective, too strategic, or too powerful to be forced into sharing the stage, the left-right distinction just vanished instantly. The structure created in 309 BC was brittle. These men were forces of nature.
So give us some examples. Who were the giants who proved that the structure was irrelevant?
Well, think of the titans who followed. We see Wei Ran, who ruled as the sole chancellor for 15 years, then Fan Zhu, who consolidated power so completely he was untouchable, and of course the most famous example.
Mui Buwei, the merchant who became prime minister and regent.
Right. None of these legends settled for being the prime minister of the left or the right. They were the sole Xiangbang, the chancellor of the state. The institutional complexity was instantly swept aside by the sheer force of these individuals' ability to command and consolidate.
The job title became singular again because the needs of command demanded a single point of authority.
And this illustrates that the Iron Law of Oligarchy isn't just about small elites forming, it's about the hierarchy within the elite. You can establish a council of 10, but power will never be distributed equally. It will flow inexorably to the most capable, the most strategic, or, well, simply the most ruthless individual.
Sovereigns can design complexity, but power will always follow competence. That really feels like the core takeaway from Qin.
And we see this pattern play out constantly, even centuries later, long after Qin unified China. The transition during the Three Kingdoms period offers a perfect, almost tragic parallel that confirms this whole dilemma.
This is the famous moment when Liu Bei, the emperor of Shu, is on his deathbed. He knew the inherent danger of naming a single regent to guide his young son, the new emperor.
Liu Bei was acutely conscious of the number 2 problem, and he tried to solve it using the exact same structural solution Qin attempted. He appointed 2 regents to guide his son, Zhuge Liang and Lian.
And Liu Bei didn't just name two people, he very carefully divided their functions, trying to build a real system of checks and balances.
Absolutely. He appointed Zhuge Liang, the strategist for civil policy, the internal administration, and he appointed Li Yan, the commander for military affairs, the external force. It was a classic, elegant, functional split.
Left-right, civil-military balance. A perfectly structured division of power designed to prevent any single regent from gaining absolute authority over both the state's resources and its armies.
It was a brilliant, optimal institutional design.
And what was the inevitable outcome?
The subsequent era was defined entirely by Zhuge Liang's strategic brilliance and dominance. Li Yan, the military regent, he eventually just faded into the background. He often found himself outmaneuvered and was ultimately marginalized by Zhuge Liang.
So the system was designed for two, but the reality of talent meant only one could lead.
Zhuge Liang's unparalleled competence in both civil and military matters meant that the beautifully designed dual regency system collapsed into a singular, all-controlling executive function.
The organizational chart said 50-50, designed for safety.
But the sheer gravitational pull of Zhuge Liang's competence was 100%. It's the ultimate confirmation that the single number two is a deep, natural tendency in politics. The sovereign tries to create a complex, multi-person cabinet, but the pressure of command, of decision-making, and of political gravity just forces a reversion to singularity.
So the number two position is inherently unstable, because the leader you need to do the job is simply too good to share the job. It's a fundamental catch-22 that spans centuries.
It is the tragedy of leadership. You require genius to command the state, but genius cannot be contained within organizational constraints.
So if we step back and look at the whole picture, the Qin experiment in 309 BC, it offers us this profound, almost cyclical lesson about the nature of power.
It does. While a single monarch is the natural state of command, a single second in command is also a deep, natural, inevitable tendency. And that's despite the sovereign's best, most elaborate, and well-intentioned efforts to create complex, multi-person cabinets or dual executive roles.
It's a recognition that structure is brittle, but ambition and competence are fundamental, unstoppable forces of nature. The king of Qin tried to mitigate the risk of a single, overpowering rival by creating this left-right system. He tried to solve the number two problem by introducing a number 2A and a number 2B.
He solved the problem of a singular consolidated threat, yes, but he simultaneously created an environment of permanent, necessary, and time-consuming rivalry. He basically institutionalized conflict at the highest level.
Which brings us back to the final, maybe more cynical political reading of this moment. The Qin king knew what he was doing, right? He was installing two strong, ambitious rivals in the highest executive office, the foreign bureaucrat versus the royal war hero. So was the left-right system truly a belief in checks and balances? Or was it a cynical political masterstroke?
It suggests the king knew the dual system would inevitably fail in the long run, but that its temporary failure bought him the one thing he couldn't generate himself: time and security.
Let us help.
By appointing two powerful men who were naturally predisposed to conflict, he guaranteed they would be so preoccupied fighting each other for resources, for credit, for prestige, that they would never coordinate their efforts or even spare a thought to challenge the throne.
Wow. So he didn't eliminate the threat. He just paid two people to manage the threat by fighting each other. He outsourced the internal conflict to the highest executive level.
That's one way to look at it.
Think about that dynamic in your own world. I mean, you've seen this play out everywhere, in corporations that appoint co-CEOs, in governments with shared portfolios, or maybe even in a family business where two siblings are given equal authority. Where have you witnessed the Iron Law force, a meticulously designed split leadership position, be it dual managers, co-chairs, or shared command back, into a singular dominant number two? It always finds a way, because the need for singular effective command is often stronger than the political desire for safety. And that's the king's ultimate tragic dilemma. If you found this discussion useful, maybe learned something new, definitely hit that subscribe button. We do these deep dives regularly, exploring valuable ideas.
We appreciate you tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.